So in the previous lecture, we discussed how fiscal policy can be used as a measure to assist the economy when we are in a recession caused by a significant decrease in aggregate demand. In this particular lecture, we're going to investigate the possibility of using fiscal policy as a means to curb demand pull inflation. And then we will talk about some of the pros and cons of fiscal policy. And in between there, we're going to talk about an idea called built-in stabilization. So what if the economy is experiencing demand pull inflation caused by too much money chasing too few goods? So a quick review of how this would occur. If the economy is in the expansionary phase of the business cycle and spending by both consumers and businesses continues to increase, we could have a situation where spending increases faster than the economy's ability to produce goods and services, which is the reason we call it demand pull inflation, private sector demand. So consumers like you and me buying durable goods, non-durable goods, and services tend to bid up the prices of finished or final goods and services. Likewise, producers, in an effort to capture even higher prices in markets, bid up the prices of resources. Right? So too much money, again, chasing too few goods, because it gets back to the very heart of economics. In other words, in the short run, we only have a limited capacity to produce. Right? So if that is the case, if the economy is experiencing demand pull inflation, what's going on with our three macroeconomic variables? Well, GDP growth would not be the problem. As a matter of fact, GDP may be growing too quickly. In other words, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 to 4%. Right? Likewise, if the economy is growing in a strong manner, then unemployment will not be an issue either. So unemployment is probably below 4.5%. So the unemployment rate's not an issue. So the real issue here is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, or the measure of inflation. So inflation could be 6, 7, 8%. Right? So the proper fiscal policy for such a situation is referred to as contractionary fiscal policy. So the federal government, right, the president, and both houses, they want to pass a measure where they will reduce aggregate demand. So how is that possible? Well, we have the same three tools of fiscal policy at the disposal of the federal government in reverse this time. So the first one is simply a decrease in government spending. So if we cut some government spending out of the economy, that will obviously shift aggregate demand to the left. Right? Likewise, we could raise the tax rates on individuals. Right? That would take some money out of the pockets of people, and they would have less disposable income, and that would decrease aggregate demand. Then, of course, we could use some combination of these two approaches. Right? We could use some decrease in government spending and some increase in the tax rate, right? And just use a combination of the two measures in order to accomplish the same goal. Well, let's look at this graphically. All right, let's assume then we're at full employment domestic output as pictured in the graph here. So we got our tools here of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So as pictured currently, aggregate demand is intersecting the aggregate supply at the Goldilocks, the perfect everything okay in the world. We're in that expansionary phase of the business cycle. So we have economic growth of roughly 3%. We have unemployment of roughly 4.5 to 5%, and we have some mild inflation, say 2.2%. Right? But what happens if aggregate demand continues to increase throughout this expansionary phase of the business cycle? Well, we see that a rightward shift in aggregate demand here. Right? Yeah, GDP will go up a bit more. Right? But notice that the real problem here is that price level starts to increase, right? So from P1 up to P2. So the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, when inflation starts to pick up. So what happens if spending continues to increase? So I've drawn the aggregate supply curve here to the point where it's gotten vertical. So you can see what happens is that at some point we're going to reach our absolute capacity to produce as an economy, because in the short run we only have a limited amount of land and capital, labor, entrepreneurability. So we've hit our sort of proverbial wall here. We're at full capacity domestic output. Right? Any increases in spending simply cause inflation, so that's why we call it too much money chasing too few goods. So what effect would contractionary fiscal policy have on the economy if we are experiencing demand pull inflation? Right, so as pictured here, price levels have gotten quite out of hand, 8% inflation. So again, the fiscal policy measures that would be proper for this current situation, demand pull inflation, right, a decrease in government spending, an increase in taxes, or some combination of the both. Right. So let's assume for the time being that simply the government cuts spending by $5 billion. Right. So a decrease in government spending by $5 billion. Well, remember that should have a multiplied effect. Right. So let's assume again that in this economy the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, marginal propensity to save is 0.25. Therefore, we have a multiplier of 4. Right. So 4 times 5, we have a total decrease in aggregate demand of $20 billion. And you can see what happens here, what the effect is. Right, the leftward shifting aggregate demand tends to bring down price levels. Right, tends to bring down price levels. Now, this is all well and good except for a couple realistic uh, implications of contractionary fiscal policy. Right, first of all, if the economy is experiencing demand pull inflation, think about logically the fiscal policy options available to the government. The first one would be to decrease government spending. Right? Well, that all sounds well and good until uh, you know politicians who have been elected start to argue over which one of their constituents are going to suffer from the decrease in spending. So in other words, if you're from Pennsylvania, you're fine in saying, okay, I don't mind if the state of Ohio or the state of California or Nevada cuts back their spending, but we don't want to cut back spending, government subsidies to certain industries within Pennsylvania because that's going to harm our local economy. Right? So typically, decreases in government spending are not very popular with voters. Right? So any decrease in social welfare benefits tends to harm Democratic voters. Any decrease in government subsidies to new industries tends to not sit well with Republican voters, and just in general, voters aren't too happy with cutting government programs. Right? The other option is an increase in taxes, which is probably less popular with voters than the decrease in government spending. I I think a lot of people can agree that there's a lot of inefficiencies with government spending. There's places where we could be cutting back on some government spending. But as far as increasing taxes, you're simply taking money right out of the pockets of people. Right? So although available, if the economy is experiencing demand pull inflation, what typically happens is that the Federal Reserve or our nation's central bank will institute monetary policy to curb inflation, which is a topic we'll be covering over the next couple of weeks. Okay, so what about this idea of discretionary fiscal policy as opposed to just building a system where things would automatically fix themselves without the government having to pass any new legislation, right? So we've been talking about discretionary fiscal policy where the president has to sign into law either an increase or decrease in government spending or a reversal of some tax rates. Right? Well, this first idea here is that net tax revenues vary directly with GDP. In some ways, there is some, or there are some built-in stabilities into our economy. So let's just think about this logically. If the economy is experiencing a recession, automatically certain types of government spending will increase, such as unemployment benefits. Likewise, tax revenues will decline. Right? So what we have here is, right, we have an automatic fiscal stimulus if the economy is in a recession, because automatically what happens is two things. Government spending, so transfer payments, we call those, right? Transfer payments go up on unemployment, right? Likewise, when fewer people are working, there's less federal income taxes collected, and when people lose their jobs, they tend to spend less money on discretionary items, things that they don't necessarily need. So again, less tax revenues are collected. So we have to some degree some built instability into the system, so to speak. Right? So the question is, well, number one, why doesn't built instability simply fix the problem? Right? And the typical answer here is that built-in automatic stabilizers would be fine if we had a very mild recession. Right? But when we're experiencing something as grand or as great as the 2007 recession, it's simply not on a big enough scale, these built instabilities, right? and built instability in the economy. This has a lot to do with the tax rates in a specific country. So if you look at the difference between the European model and the American model, right, the Europeans decided to adopt more of a social welfare state the better part of 2 decades again, where they had much higher tax rates in general and much more generous social welfare programs, right? Which all sounds well and good, but remember, there's a trade-off. Right? The basic idea of economics is you can't have something for nothing. Right? There's always a cost to your decision, and the cost is that over that same period, economic growth in most parts of Europe has been about half to 60% of what it was in the United States. Okay, so fiscal policy seems like a great idea to combat any significant decline in aggregate spending and aggregate demand, where we have a recession caused by a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. So when the private sector is simply not filling in that total spending gap, right? So if we have a deficiency in aggregate demand and we have high unemployment, negative GDP, it seems like expansionary fiscal policy is a wonderful idea. But unfortunately, there are some criticisms or some critiques of expansionary fiscal policy. And the first one is the problem of timing. And there's sort of three aspects to this. Right? It's not always easy to recognize a recession. Right? Now, this last recession withstanding, because it was so severe, so precipitous that it was obvious to anyone basically with a brain and a pulse that the economy was faltering on a very large scale. But if we look at previous downturns, so for instance, the economic recession of 1991, it was on a much more mild scale. A lot of white-collar workers lost their job as opposed to your typical blue-collar worker recession, right? So sometimes it's not all that easy to recognize that the economy is in a recession, right? And we don't want to sort of jump the gun on policy measures if the economy is not in a recession. So between the time that the economy actually falls or falters and the time the government decides to do something about it, right, there could be what's called a recognition lag. Right? The next one is referred to as the administrative lag. Right? There's an old joke about Washington, D.C. that it takes the people in Washington, D.C. an hour and a half to watch 60 Minutes. In other words, things happen so slowly in Washington, D.C. because in our nation's capital because, all right, let's face it, Democrats and Republicans don't always agree on policy measures. Now, again, this last recession was not a good example of administrative lag because right before George Bush left office, he instituted a significant fiscal stimulus, and as soon as Barack Obama took office, he instituted an even larger fiscal stimulus. And again, it gets back to the idea that the downturn was so enormous that something had to be done. So we didn't have very much of an administrative lag in this previous recession. Now the last one is probably the most significant, the idea of an operational lag. So maybe while you were driving around in your cars since 2007, you saw on the side of the roads the signs for the Obama fiscal stimulus to help the highways. Well, some of that money was put to use right away, but believe it or not, some of the money that was set aside for the fiscal stimulus way back in 2008 has not been spent yet. And the reason is because although the projects are in the works, so to speak, they haven't been approved by the state or local government, or they simply haven't had the environmental studies, or they just haven't had the wherewithal to get the project up and running. So if you're gonna repair a bridge, or you're gonna fix a road, or you're gonna spend some money on infrastructure, those type of enormous projects typically don't happen overnight. They take quite a while to get off the ground and up and running, right? So there could be an issue because what if you spend all this money on fiscal stimulus and it takes 2 years, 3 years, 4 years for that fiscal stimulus to actually work its way into the economy? Well, we could have recovered by then, right? The economy could have turned itself around, and any type of fiscal stimulus at that point might be sort of counterproductive and might actually start to cause inflation. All right, so that's the problem of timing. Now, the political business cycle refers to a simple idea: is that Now let's face it, most politicians are in the business of getting reelected, so they could simply add some we call like window dressing to make the economy look better during the last year or 18 months of their tenure as a politician. Right, so they might add some fiscal stimulus simply to make things look better. Right. The next idea here of future policy reversals. All right, let's think what happened. So Barack Obama takes office. His first 2 years he runs record federal budget deficits, $1.3 trillion in each year. And I know now voters were a little bit nervous when the federal budget deficit approached 450 or 500 billion dollars under George Bush during the first year of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now we have federal budget deficits almost triple that level. So you had this Tea Party come into office where their whole entire mandate was lower taxes and less government spending. So cut out all that unnecessary government spending and lower the tax rates. Well, when the, the Tea Party politicians got elected, they pretty much put a cap on any new programs for government spending. Right? So you had there's a good example of a policy reversal. You had all this fiscal stimulus signed into law in 2008, and then you had all of these Tea Party members voting against any new type of increase in government spending because they're worried about the federal budget deficit and the national debt. Right? Again, this next problem or complication of fiscal stimulus, the 2000 recession is a great example of this. The federal budget, the federal government can run a federal budget deficit. In other words, Uncle Sam can spend more money than we take in tax revenues and finance that deficit by selling bonds. Right? We already explained this in great detail in a previous lecture. Unfortunately, states are mandated by their local constitutions to run a balanced budget. Right? So states don't have the same luxury as the federal government. So what happens typically is that during severe recessions, right, state governments cut way back on all kinds of government programs and actually increase taxes. Right? So if you think about what's happening here is that the federal government lowers tax rates and increases government spending during a recession. At the same time, state and local governments are increasing taxes and cutting government spending. Right? Now, you can see that that's like a tug of war between the federal government and the state and local governments as far as policy. It also has significant impact on local economies. In other words, if you look at the unemployment rate of a state like North Dakota, it's something like 1.2%. Right? So the economic recession hasn't had much impact on North Dakota. Right? As opposed to if you look at the unemployment rate in somewhere like like Florida or even Vegas, which used to have something an unemployment rate near zero. Those two states struggle mightily. So if those particular states, California is another good example. California has severe problems when it comes to their state budgets, right? So if California starts to cut back on government programs and government spending and increases taxes, that's going to be particularly bad for that state. Now, the last idea is a bit complicated. We'll spend a couple minutes on this. It's called the crowding out effect. And now here's how this works. So the economy's in a recession. What's the proper fiscal policy measures for a recession? Expansionary fiscal policy, which means an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes or some of both. Right? So if the economy is in a recession, the federal government's going to run a federal budget deficit. They're going to borrow money. Right? They're going to borrow money. So in order to stimulate economic activity, the federal government runs a deficit. What impact will that have on what we call interest rates? Well, in order to borrow money, right, the federal government sells bonds, and bonds are denominated in U.S. dollars. So in simplest terms, easiest way to explain this, and we're going to go into much more detail about the money market when we cover this in future weeks, is that the selling of government bonds by the federal government, right, that increases the demand for money, which pushes up domestic interest rates. Right? Well, we know that there's an inverse relationship between interest rates and the level of investment spending. So if you think about the typical business out there, whether it's a small, medium-sized, or large business, right, higher interest rates stifle investment spending because businesses are always weighing the real rate of interest versus the expected rate of return. So federal budget deficits, which push up interest rates, right? So federal budget deficits can have an impact on some private sector spending. I know typically, you know, most economists agree that, again, some of this can be offset with monetary policy. That is, our Federal Reserve lowering interest rates, and we'll go into how and why they do that later. But the real issue might be what's the long-term impact of running deficits year over year, decade over decade? Right? Could it be that over a long period of time, not only does the federal government run deficits, but they start to create a situation where, just like an individual who has too much of a debt burden, right, it's going to be difficult for those people to get loans, and they can only get loans at higher rates. Right, this is one possibility of 10, 15, 20 years down the road that buyers of U.S. government debt might be less willing to purchase government bonds because they view the U.S. government as a more risky asset. Right? They view those government bonds as significantly more risk, so they're going to demand a higher interest rate in order to buy those bonds.